Good morning. Good morning, everyone. All right. Welcome to today's Coffee with the Curator. Thank you for joining us on this kind of nice Monday morning. We're getting closer and closer to spring every single day, which is great. Before we get started, I actually want to plug next month's Coffee with the Curator. So on May 8th at 10:30, Rachel Holstag, our Associate Curator, is going to be talking about two really significant artworks in our institution, and those are the Lewandowski murals. So in 2003, when renovations began to the FIA's building, two large glass mosaics by Edmund Lewandowski were uncovered beneath the sheetrock. The mosaics were commissioned by the museum in 1958 to complement the new modern building, and they were located in the lobby and the entrance, kind of near the entrance of the main exhibition hall. Sometime in the next 4 decades, the murals were covered and basically moved to their current position. If you're not familiar with where the murals are, it's down the hallway in the south entrance. And this talk is going to take a look at the murals themselves, their symbolism, and the complicated journey from one spot to another for us to allow visitors to see them again. So that's next month. Should be a really fantastic talk. Today, though, we're going to get into another kind of signature artwork of the FIA, which is out in the lobby. As you came in, you passed by. We're going to talk a little bit about Sophie Matisse's Guernica. However, in order to talk about Guernica by Matisse, we have to go back and talk about the other Guernica. So today we're going to look at both Pablo Picasso and Sophie Matisse's painting of war, basically. There are images of destruction, both from the past and from much more recent. So I included those in the presentation. So let's get into a little bit about the origins of Guernica as a painting. So the painting was made in 1937. It has become one of the 20th century's most powerful indictments against war. And for many people, the power of the imagery is still really relevant today. Sophie Matisse is one of those individuals who saw the Picasso painting and kept that kind of in her mind and reacted after she herself experienced another trauma. So let's get into a little history of the painting itself. The image on the screen is a postcard from the 1938 World's Fair, or the Internationale Exposition, and the painting was made for this World's Fair. So at the beginning of 1937, Picasso received a commission for the newly elected Spanish Republic. They asked him to produce a large-scale painting for the Spanish pavilion at the World's Fair. So many different countries had basically these large pavilions, either within one large building or in smaller kind of ancillary buildings. And it was a chance for the country to show off their best and brightest. Now, the theme for the 1938 World's Fair was actually a celebration of modern technology. However, after Picasso heard the news of the aerial bombing of the Basque town Guernica, he decided to go a little bit in a different direction, and the painting left a lasting impression. So neither his preparatory drawings or the finished image contain specific elements connected to Guernica, but we know through a ton of research and Picasso talking about it that this was in fact a reaction to the news of the bombing of Guernica. It comes off as a more of a generic plea against the barbarity and the terror of war, and a lament against fascism. So it's one of the reasons this feels so timeless, is there is no direct connection to the actual moment. Matisse, when she repainted Picasso's Guernica, borrowed that tradition. There is no specific reference to her connection but it makes it very timeless. So I want to get into the event itself that kind of spawned this entire painting. So before we get into the day that Guernica was bombed, we're going to talk a little bit about the Spanish Civil War. So the Spanish Civil War began in 1936, and it was between the Democratic Republic government and the fascist forces, which were being led by General Franco Francisco. General Francisco Franco. This is in Spain, by the way. So the Spanish Civil War, it was heavily covered by media. This is an earlier war. We have war imagery from previous wars, but this one was heavily covered by the media and then distributed throughout the world. In fact, there were articles about Guernica in US newspapers. But Picasso at the time was living in Paris, so that's how he became aware of the events of Guernica's bombing. So there was a mass distribution of images of this war, and it was done in part to record, of course, the cruelty of the fascist regime, but it was also done for strategic purposes. So photographers would be sent out to areas of destruction and photograph what happened, and that would turn into kind of fuel for the Republic to kind of say, look at what Franco was doing, look at the atrocities of war. So that's exactly what Picasso ended up seeing. So on April 26, 1937, at the height of the Spanish Civil War, Guernica was bombed, and it was bombed by the Luftwaffe, Hitler's powerful German Air Force. And Hitler comes into play because he was basically granted permission to do this by General Franco. So two fascist leaders kind of working together in this moment. And realistically, what ended up happening, or why they did this, it was essentially a training mission. And it was a training mission designed to test a new bombing tactic that would intimidate and terrorize the Republic, and of course, the Spanish people. Guernica was a town that had no real strategic military value. There was nothing there that would have warranted an attack on this scale. So they did it to intimidate and to kill. And it basically kind of acted as a model as what we see happening in World War II. So it signaled the start of systematic attacks on civilians, kind of as a strategy of war. Over 3 hours, 25 bombs dropped 100,000 pounds of explosives and incendiary bombs on the village. 20 more fighter planes went through and shot anyone they could find that was still running. So there was mass destruction, and the photograph on screen is some of the photographs of the aftermath of the Guernica bombing. Images like this are what would have been produced in news outlets throughout the world. So there was mass destruction. Fires burned for 3 days, 70% of the city was destroyed. A third of the population, so about 1,600 civilians, were either wounded or killed. So a mass destruction moment, aiming for mass casualties, a very cruel moment in the history of the Spanish Civil War. So by May, so just a week or so later, the news of the atrocity traveled from Spain to Paris. Paris is where Picasso was living, and he was kind of going about his life, and then he started to see news of this in the newspapers. So there was heavy imagery. We'll move on to the next slide so you don't have to continue to look at the black and white photographs. So he was able to see secondhand the devastation of this bombing. So he was already very anti-Franco, and he started a series even before the bombing that really started to show his political stance on the fascist regime. So the, kind of going back to the newspaper, there were eyewitness reports and sometimes front page images across, as I said before, international newspapers, but particularly in Paris. He was completely horrified when he saw the devastation. Spain, of course, is Picasso's home country. So not only did he make a connection just for the humanity of the event, it was also his home country, so he was even more disturbed by what he saw. And he thought, okay, instead of presenting technology at the World's Fair, I'm going to show the world what the Spanish people are dealing with. So that's exactly what he did. He completed the painting in less than a month and then delivered it to the Spanish pavilion of the World's Fair. And in addition to Picasso's efforts at that pavilion, other people in Spain that were involved in the World's Fair, they wanted to show, kind of reiterate this suffering. So it included, in addition to this large painting, it included documentary films, newsreels, and photographs of what the fascist regime was doing. So Spain kind of as a whole took it upon themselves to say, all right, we're not talking about technology, we're going to talk about what's really happening. And of course it caused a lot of uproar for visitors of the fair, and it opened a lot of people's eyes to what was actually happening in this country. So later in the 1940s, this is kind of a little side story, but later in the 1940s, when Paris was occupied by the Nazis, a German Nazi officer entered into Picasso's studio, and in his studio he had a photograph of himself standing in front of Guernica. And according to Picasso, the visitor said, he pointed at it and said, "Did you do that?" alluding to the painting. And Picasso looked at him and said, "No, you did." A little feisty for sure. So he had very outspoken views on what was happening in Spain. So what you see on screen here, these are actually part of the FIA's collection. And they are two works on paper by Picasso. I'll show you the first one here, and then the second one is a little dark. But they were created in 1937. So they were started before the bombing. He kind of was thinking about how he could be politically active. And what he ended up doing, or what his intention was to create these little drawings and sell them as postcards. And what their narrative is that they're denouncing the Spanish nationalist government run by Franco. So again, this kind of anti-Franco imagery. And he intended to sell them as postcards with the funds going toward the Spanish Republican government, which would then hopefully aid anyone affected by the Spanish Civil War. So some of the scenes were created before, and some were created after the bombing of Guernica. So we start to see a little bit of a visual reference in these drawings, especially if you look at the top left. That horse, we're going to see a version of that horse again in Guernica. Right here, we also see a version of that in Guernica. Same thing here. So you can tell that he's already starting to play around with the composition before the bombing actually even happens. In this plate, it's the same kind of concept here. He's kind of making fun of Franco a little bit in this one. So Franco is in the upper left corner. He's kind of this monstrous grinning figure, and he is participating in mass destruction. In the middle of the image, we start to see his downfall. We see him harassing a bull, which is a symbol of the country of Spain. And in general, Picasso is kind of poking fun, trying to kind of make fun of Franco and his shortcomings, but also illuminate what is going on for any visitor who would end up purchasing these postcards. I'll go back to the last one, or the first one, so you can see a little bit of detail. Now, in both of these, you're going to see it's a sketch, so it's not as refined as what we are accustomed with when we see Picasso's final paintings, but a lot of the elements are there. There are a lot of sharp, angular lines. The space has become very flat. So there's all of these little elements that we are familiar with, if you're familiar with Picasso's Cubist style, that will continue and kind of transition into Guernica. So I've talked a lot about Guernica, and I haven't shown you the actual painting yet, the original Picasso painting, so here it is. Now, I said he painted this in a month, which is incredible because it is an incredibly large canvas. And in addition to painting, he created a ton of preparatory images. So in addition to those two prints that we just saw, which connected to Guernica, but a little bit before, in addition to that, there are 50 other preliminary sketches where he's thinking about this composition. And he really wanted to express pain in a way that would be timeless and kind of reach every viewer. So let's talk a little bit about the final composition. On the far left, we have a woman with her head held back, screaming in pain, holding on to the lifeless body of what we presume is her child. Picasso was very closed-lipped when it came to the analysis of Guernica, so he doesn't say a whole lot about that. But it's hard to look at that image and think about the history of art and not think about the image of, it's called the Pietà, so it's Mary holding on to Jesus after he was removed from the cross. So, and where an image like that, Picasso would have been familiar with. So we have, next to that, we have a head and a partial body of a large bull. It's almost kind of turning in space. This is really the only pseudo, at least it appears to be, unharmed figure amongst the chaos. Beneath them and next to the woman, you see a dead or wounded man. He's kind of mouth open, arms stretched up, and then what you see looks like a severed arm holding on to a broken sword. In the center, we have an iconic, terrified horse. The horse has been pierced with a spear in its side. You can see kind of a large wound right here. Then we have another grouping of women. So we have one woman that's kind of rushing into the scene, looking up at this looking up at this light bulb right here. Then we have another woman, so that's the woman rushing in. Then there's another woman who appears to be reaching out of a window. She's got a lantern in her arm, and it looks as though she's again fleeing or reaching toward that light. And then the third woman on the far right, she appears to be trapped, maybe inside of a building, and she is screaming in fear and terror with her arms up. Heads are always tilted. The ones who are screaming, their heads are tilted toward the sky, exaggerating that emotional experience. So, breaking this image down, it's chaotic. When you first look at this, it is a jumble of shapes and partial figures, and you're kind of thrown into the middle of the action. But there's also something that is a little bit grounding in this image. So in general, the composition creates a large triangle from the fingers down here to the horse and then back. So he's giving us his very typical Picasso-esque style, but then also grounding us. So you don't look at this image and say, oh, this is too chaotic, I don't understand what's going on, I'm gonna disregard it. He knows that he has to give you something that really keeps you looking. So despite its chaotic nature, it is a solid, grounded image. It also is very representative of Picasso's style. So you have a space that's very compressed. There are multiple viewpoints. Bodies are fragmented and distorted. And all of these things are typical of Picasso and Cubism. If I was asking this question on the test, I'd say, how does this represent Cubism? And it's just a checkbox of every single element that Picasso utilized in his Cubist style. The one thing that we don't see in some of his Cubist artwork is a monochromatic color scheme. And we'll talk about that in a second. So, mass destruction, mass devastation, but as I mentioned before, there is no very specific element that reminds us that this is Guernica, besides the title, of course. So this becomes a timeless image of suffering. So thinking about the color scheme, this is painted in black and white, which for a painting this large is really quite rare. When I think about all of the paintings that have made the Rolodex of my mind, I can't think of another thing that is painted in this way. So it didn't go unnoticed. People very quickly were like, why did you paint this in black and white and shades of gray? Why did you not use color? You've used color in many of your artwork. Was it because he was rushed? He painted it in a month. Maybe he didn't have time. And it wasn't that. It was because it makes another connection to what was happening at the time. So he chose to paint Guernica in this stark monochromatic gray color palette. And he did it because of how he received the information. He had seen dramatic photos published in various periodicals. There was a French newspaper called La Humanité, which covered this story extensively. So he saw images of Guernica through the lens of the press. So he saw it in black and white. He then experienced it in black and white. So the starkness references that, but it also kind of pulls everything else away. So you are meant to focus on the figures and the forms. And contrasting, using very contrasted shades of light and dark, kind of amplify the sharp contrast of the shapes and the composition itself. So it's meant to be jarring, it's meant to be jagged. Referencing newsprint one more time, if you notice the horse, especially in the middle, there are these hash marks. It's very similar to the printing process, which in order to get it gray, you would create small dots of black. The closer those dots are together, the darker the black becomes. You're probably all familiar with this if you stared at a photograph in a newspaper. You look really close, you can see the dots. So he's thinking about experiencing this as a contemporary living in 1938. So this was brought to the World's Fair. It created an international moment, an international sensation, and it has moved around a little bit. Before we talk about what happened to it after the pavilion, I want to show you a couple images of the process. I always love when artists document their process. It's so fascinating. And Picasso was dating a woman named Dora Maar at the time when he painted this, and she was a photographer. So she documented over and over process images. So this is one of them. This is kind of the beyond the early sketches, and these are the lines on the canvas. And you can kind of see him working things out. Do you notice how there are some different elements? So we've got that figure with the sword, this character right here. He's facing a different way, but the same concept here. This is very similar, not too much different than the final work. Same thing with the women, these two women here. But you can see later on he goes in and adds a light and adds some details. Here's a photograph of Picasso in front of Guernica. And in the process, he's painting. So it's a little hard to see, but I think he's either, unfortunately the photograph cut off, he's either painting down toward the bottom of the canvas, or what he might be doing is dipping this long paintbrush into the paint. So this painting, in addition to becoming one of the most famous paintings of the 20th century, is heavily documented. And then after its creation, it's even more heavily documented. So before we get a little bit further along into talking about maybe what it symbolizes, the elements, and Sophie Matisse making the connection here to Flint, I want to just give you a little rundown of where it's been. It's a really interesting story. So, as I said initially, this was commissioned by the government. So the government asked Picasso to paint it with the assumption that the painting would remain in Spain. So they acquired it from him in 1937. This is the Republic government, not the fascist regime. But at the outbreak of the Second World War, Picasso thought, oh, this is really iffy. So after the World's Fair, it traveled across the world, and we start to see the political climate in Europe change into the early 40s. And Picasso was very nervous because he knew what this stood for, and he knew if this returned to Spain, there was a chance that it would be destroyed. So on the outbreak of the Second World War, the painting was sent to the United States, and it was on loan at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City at Picasso's, at his request. And basically what he said is that the painting shall remain in the United States at the MoMA until Spain, quote, enjoyed public liberties and democratic institutions. So that took a little while. The work was finally returned to Spain in 1981. So from the beginning of World War II to 1981, this was not in Spain, where Picasso had intended it to be his entire, the entire time. So it's currently at the Museo Reina Sofia, which is Spain's National Museum of Modern Art, and it's in Madrid. And it's got its own room, and it's very large, as you know, by the size of Sophie Matisse's painting. And it has become one of the most visited paintings in that museum, but in Spain. So it finally made its way back. The museum, if you're really interested in learning a ton more about this painting, the museum itself has a whole website dedicated to this, and you can see all sorts of documents and photographs. So people saw this and they were moved. But then, of course, we always want to know what it is, why. Why did he make those decisions that he made? What does it mean? So we know it references the bombing of Guernica. That's a very clear element of this. But there has been endless debate in the world of art history about the meaning of the elements inside of Guernica. As I said before, Picasso said very little about the meaning, except that it was simply an appeal to people about massacred people and animals. So he was really vague. He said, in the panel on which I am working, which I called Guernica, I clearly express my abhorrence to military caste, and which has sunk Spain into the ocean of pain and death. So his abhorrence to the military caste, which has sunk Spain into the ocean of pain and death. He also said, it is up to the painter to define the symbols. Otherwise, we would be, I'm sorry, I love this quote. It's up to the painter to define the symbols. Otherwise, it would be better if you wrote them out in so many words. The public who look at the picture must interpret the symbols as they understand them. So he basically said, if I'm going to tell you what this means, I should have just written about it as opposed to painting it. I painted it because I want you to interpret this. And art historians have definitely done that. So some of the things that he did note is he did say that the bull represents brutality and darkness. And a lot of historians and people who are thinking about this, so they know that tiny tidbit of information. So a lot of people see the bull as Franco. They see him in that image as this almost a Minotaur-esque bull. If you look at the bull, it has kind of human-ish elements. And the Minotaur, of course, is a nod to ancient Greek, the ancient Greek story of the Minotaur, Theseus, and the island of Crete. Half man, half bull, so very ferocious. Once a year, he would consume a number of people from the mainland. So this really ferocious creature. So if in fact this is about brutality, some people have understood that as Franco. The mother and child, we've talked a little bit about interpreting as maybe a connection to the Madonna and Christ. Some people have looked at that light at the very top and interpreted it as an eye and a lamp or a light. It's very clearly a light bulb, but then what is that eye? Some think it's the eye of hope, while others have interpreted it as the ever-watchful eye of the fascist regime. So you've got exactly opposite ends of the spectrum there. This figure here kind of rushing in with a lamp, some have seen that figure as a symbol of hope. If you're familiar with, living in France, you would have been familiar with this. If you're familiar with Liberty Leading the People, it's a painting where a woman is kind of pushing through the destruction of civil battle in Paris, and she's kind of an icon of liberty. So perhaps that's what we've got going on there. But he's never fully committed to telling us how to interpret this, so we interpret it in our own way. That's exactly what Sophie Matisse decided to do. So because of its recognition as a painting that represents the destruction of war, Guernica has become a global icon and has become subject to countless reinterpretations, inspirations, and reproductions. And of course, we have one of those at the FIA. So let's talk about Sophie. We're gonna get to our work now. So Sophie Matisse was born in 1965, and she was raised in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She studied at the Massachusetts College for Art and Design in Boston, and then she moved to Paris and studied at the École des Beaux-Arts. So the name is interesting. In the history of art, we've got Matisse. So we think maybe she's related to that Matisse, and in fact she is. So her great-grandfather was Henri Matisse, arguably one of the most significant painters in the early 20th century. He pushed past realism into almost abstraction, and he starts to break the form down. Very, very well known in the history of art. We have a painting by Henri Matisse on view in our Arabia Gallery. So her great-grandfather was a well-known painter. Her grandfather, his name was Pierre Matisse, he moved to the United States and became a well-known art dealer. And then her father, her father's name is Pablo Matisse, he is a prolific sculptor. Her step-grandfather was also Marcel Duchamp. I mean, you can't grow up around more artists, I think. So she's got this incredible lineage, which was a double-edged sword. She's got the name recognition, but she talks quite a bit about how that created an immense amount of pressure on her as a child. She did not have a relationship with her famous great-grandfather. He passed away before she was born. He was also not talked about in the family very often. And she saw him kind of as an enigmatic figure. She knew that they were related, they had a famous name, he was one of the greats, but there was not a personal connection. So she wanted to carve her own path. After attending the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, she created a series. This is the first series that kind of gained her recognition. It's called Be Back in 5 Minutes. So she grew up within the realm of history, the history of art. So it's kind of not surprising that she plays on the history of art in this series. So this is called the series is called Be Back in 5 Minutes, and what she's done is she's recreated famous paintings, but removed all of the figures. This was started with a conversation between her and her husband about the Mona Lisa being really annoyed that everyone was looking at her. And so what would happen if she just got up and left? And so in this case, all of the figures have got up and left. The night hawks, of course, you have the soda jerk behind the counter, and there are figures here lined up. Las Meninas would have the princess, the infanta, and her attendants, a number of other figures related to the royal family, and then of course a large image of Diego Velázquez, the artist of Las Meninas. So she removed a significant amount of figures from this painting. Same thing with Life's Questions here. This is based on a Gauguin painting that's just full of figures, kind of explaining the cycle of life. So this gained her a little bit of notoriety, and of course her famous name has, had an effect on her. But she started to really think about what she wanted to do, how she should proceed, and if she wanted to continue painting. And her gallerist just brought up this comment one day, and he said, "What do you think about repainting Guernica? You've already made a name for yourself by painting things related to the history of art. What about Picasso's Guernica?" And she said, "That's funny you should mention that. I have been thinking about that painting for months. I have been, it's been in the back of my mind, and it's been in the back of my mind because of the events of September 11th, 2001. So this is the painting before it made its way to Flint. This is in Francis Naumann's gallery. And her interpretation, you'll see the composition is the same, but she's changed one major thing, which is the color. So this painting is not only a comment on the attack on the World Trade Center and the US in 2001, but it also warns of the dangers that could result if the US should engage in a war with Iraq. Now that's what she talked about at the time. We all know what happened later on. So this painting was completed in 2003. So she was incredibly affected by the events of September 11th, 2001. She wanted to reiterate the message of Picasso's Guernica, but she wanted to fuse it with a bold color palette. And initially what her intention was to basically connect Picasso and her great-grandfather, Matisse. Matisse is known for these bright, luscious colored paintings. And when she started thinking, as she was painting and creating the composition, she said, my great-grandfather wouldn't choose these. They're almost garish, how bright some of the colors are. And she decided at that point that she wasn't just going to copy Picasso and then copy Matisse. She wanted to use her own feelings in this in this painting. So although they're bright, they are much more vibrant and contrasting than what her great-grandfather would have used. While she was painting this, there was actually an exhibition at one of the MoMAs in New York that was a dual show of artwork by Picasso and Matisse. So it was kind of, this perfect moment to create this. So whereas Picasso relied on photographs of innocent victims and the destruction of the town that he had seen in newspapers, she relied on her personal experience. So on 9/11, she was walking her daughter to school. So she actually watched the plane hit the tower. She said she could see a plane shape as it hit the building. And all of the events after that, of course, we've lived through, and we know how much that had a grip on the country. But actually experiencing it was very traumatic. So, we experienced watching these things. And not only did she live it in real life, in live color, she also spent the next months, next year, next multiple years experiencing it through photographs and through television, all of which were in color. So the major difference between the original painting and this is the color palette. Bright, vibrant. The narrative is still there. It is still a timeless image, but she has updated it for her own experience and to connect to all of those people who have experienced that with her. Think about all of the people who were at the Spanish Pavilion and how they saw Guernica in newspapers. They saw all of those things. They have a similar experience as many of the visitors that remember September 11th when they see Guernica here, and they learned that was her inspiration. So she said, when her painting was finished, she said that after September 11th, she was very scared, and somehow life as we knew it would never be the same, and making art was something that she might never be able to do again. Although she now admits that it may sound extreme, she believed that's how scared she was at the time. She said, obviously it was a difficult time, and I was always convinced we were all on the verge of getting attacked again, and that I wouldn't be able to be as lucky to survive this time. She notes that she was never really a huge fan of Picasso's work, but something about this painting connected with her, and she started looking at it, and then of course her gallerist said, hey, let's think about Guernica. She said that there was an interesting moment too that happened after the terror attacks on September 11th. She said after watching TV coverage, she saw Colin Powell give a speech at the UN in favor of going to war, and he did it in front of a covered tapestry of Guernica. She was motivated to explore her feelings even more after that. So there was a tapestry in the UN, there's a tapestry at the UN of Guernica, and they thought, we should cover this up for this press, for this press coverage. She updates a little bit and kind of makes connections to 9/11 in this painting, specifically the far right-hand side. We've talked about this figure once before, but on the right-hand side of the canvas, there is the figure in red, the one with her arms outstretched. She seems to be almost falling through the air, and the background, instead of just a building, a kind of black building, let me go back to Picasso's really quickly, you see how it's very dark, and you're almost focused on the white square. So what she's done is turned it into a gray building, and the gray building has stripes, very much like the World Trade Center. So in those elements, she's not changing the composition, but she is bringing very specific moments to our attention. She said, I made that shape behind the falling woman gray with vertical lines, just like the World Trade Center. She knew it was painting this brightly was going to be a risky move, but she felt really compelled to complete it in vibrant colors. And she really explored a lot here. This was the first time she'd ever used acrylic paint. She figured gouache was too delicate and it would have been exponentially expensive to paint it with oil. So this was her first foray into acrylic paint, and she loved the medium after that. Some people made connections between her color and then her great-grandfather's color. But as I said before, she kind of took it one step beyond. Picasso and Matisse knew of each other. They had kind of a friendly rivalry, I guess you could say. But in Sophie's family, they didn't talk about Picasso. There was kind of a family rivalry within the multiple generations. So she said she was never fully a fan of his artwork, but this one particular piece really stuck out to her. So when asked about the painting's connection to Matisse and Picasso, she said, "My version of Picasso's Guernica was inspired by the events of September 11th, 2001. It was never my intention to fuse Matisse and Picasso completely. Picasso would have never done this painting in color, and Matisse would have never made a painting about war. My inspiration for the kind of colors I used came about from how I see colors on television, bright and brash. And even though the colors I ended up using all came from natural sources, the effect feels to me more artificial, somehow to how I felt about the time we were living in Lower Manhattan and about the kind of information we were being fed at the time." So, in general, both of these paintings are timeless. They both have to do with death and destruction, and they both create a really powerful moment for visitors. Without Picasso and without Guernica, Sophie Matisse would have found another way to express her grief and her anxiety, but with this, we get to see that timelessness revived in a new way. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes?
How did FIA come to acquire the piece?
That's a great question. So I don't exactly know if John Henry visited Francis Nauman's gallery and saw it, but going back in our records, I found that we sought it out. We asked if it was available, and we had a generous donor help us pay for it. What I have to imagine is the director at the time made a trip to New York and saw it in person. He knew Francis Nauman, and so I think he might have seen it. And so we purchased it directly from the gallery and from Sophie, and it was kind of revealed in the lobby when we went through one of our major renovations. So there was a big celebration. She came into town. I don't know if she did a lecture or not, but she was here to kind of see it on the wall. Yes?
Didn't Sophie Matisse create other versions of this?
There are a couple other versions of this that are much more kind of her own hand. So I've seen two versions by her that don't look as much like the original, but they are the same theme. So yes, she did explore this theme more than once. Back.
Yeah, how come Spain didn't get into World War II? Because there were some questions about that destruction in that country as well.
That's a great question. I don't know enough about Spanish politics to know why they weren't much more involved, like Italy was really involved. I would have to do some research on that, I'm not sure. Yes?
I had the opportunity last summer to go to Spain and see this, and one of the questions that was answered for me at the time was that supposedly Franco had a deal with Mussolini and Hitler, that if he allowed them to come in and test out their weaponry on his population to keep him in power, they would not then come in and invade Spain. But the story goes that Hitler was going to do him in eventually anyway and take over Spain, but that didn't happen.
Thank you, that makes a lot of sense, yeah, thanks. Any other questions? Well, Well, I usually say make sure to go through the galleries and see the artwork that we're talking about, but you'll see it when you leave. But I do encourage you all to go through the galleries. We have a couple exhibitions that, well, one that has just recently closed, but one that will be closing back in the graphics gallery. It closes at the end of this week, so if you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend that. Yes?
Just as a reference to the Spanish Civil War, this weekend, Detroit Opera House is presenting Anne of Tears, which is about Federico Garcia Lorca, who was murdered by fascists in 1956.
Wonderful.
So, we're ticket.
Yeah.
And it's billed as opera meets flamenco.
Nice. All right, well, if there's no other questions, enjoy the rest of your day and yeah, spend some time looking at that, thinking about what you think about the painting, since neither artist gave us a script on what we're supposed to interpret. You know, how does it relate to your experiences? So have a great day, and hopefully we'll see you next month, and then there'll be one more after that in June. I will be talking about candy and cakes and art. So, the sweet ending for the season. Thank you very much for coming.